Hello, friends. Let me tell you something strange that most people today don't even realize ever happened. In the flickering shadows of candlelight, when the moon cast long beams across straw-covered floors, and the fire in the hearth began to die, people in 14th century Europe did not lie flat in bed as we do today. Instead, they sat, upright through the night, half reclined, heads tilted, legs stretched, arms gently folded across their laps or clutched around a wool blanket pulled up to the chest. And they slept like that, all night. But why? Why would someone choose to sleep in such an awkward position? Tonight, we'll journey into the dim, smoky homes of the Middle Ages to find out. We'll open the creaking doors of time and settle beside flickering hearths to witness how these people lived, what they feared, and what they believed about sleep, health, and even the afterlife. Now lean back, take a deep breath, and let's begin. It's the year 1351, in the heart of a small English village nestled among fields of barley and wheat. The plague has passed, though its shadow still lingers in whispered stories and hollowed families, and life is slowly returning to its rhythm. In this small timber-framed cottage, the walls are stuffed with wattle and daub, patched and damp from the endless chill of northern air. A single room serves as kitchen, bedroom, and workshop, and inside it lives a family of 5. At the end of the day, the smell of boiled barley and onion stew clings to the ceiling beams. The fire has been stoked with the last piece of oak kindling. The father, Thomas, a cobbler by trade, removes his leather apron and places it gently beside the stool where he spends long hours shaping shoes. His wife, Agnes, hums softly as she tidies the remnants of supper. No plates, just rough wooden trenchers. And the 2 youngest children have already curled on a sack stuffed with dry leaves in the corner, where a cat has made itself at home on their feet. And when it is time for sleep, Thomas does not lie down. Instead, he sits, back against a slanted headboard of rough wood, his shoulders slightly hunched forward, a woolen blanket draped around his chest, and a bonnet snug on his head. Agnes does the same beside him. They sit like statues, breathing slowly in the silence, while the wind whistles gently through the cracks in the shutters. This wasn't an accident. They weren't caught mid-nap. They chose to sleep that way because lying flat was for the dead. You see, in the minds of many medieval people, to lie down fully was an invitation to death. The flat position was reserved for corpses, stretched out for burial, eyes closed, hands folded on the chest. Sleeping lying down wasn't just seen as strange, it was considered dangerous. It symbolized death. And people were afraid of what might come if you tempted fate by imitating the dead. But the fears ran even deeper. Many believed that while you slept, your soul would drift, loosened from the body, floating into the air like smoke curling from a chimney. To sleep lying down meant your soul might float too far, far enough that it couldn't find its way back before morning. And if it didn't, you wouldn't wake. So people propped themselves up with pillows stuffed with horsehair or straw, wooden wedges behind their backs, or even tied themselves in place with rough cloth bands to prevent sliding down in the night. They were not always comfortable, but comfort wasn't the point. Safety was. And for those with money, beds were tall and often surrounded by heavy drapes, not just for warmth but to keep out evil spirits, cold drafts, or even nosy rodents. The beds were raised off the ground to stay away from the dirt, but also because people feared what might crawl or climb up from the earth. The rich might sleep on beds with linen sheets, though rarely washed, and feather-stuffed mattresses, though full of lice. The poor, like Thomas and Agnes, slept on sacks of straw, or just a cloak over a wooden bench. But regardless of wealth, the sleeping position remained the same, upright. Even kings and queens, with their silks and spices, their towers and courtiers, slept this way. A chronicler once described a noblewoman preparing for bed as having retired into her pillows as though into her throne. And still, there's more to uncover. This sleeping posture also had a practical side. In a time before modern medicine, digestion was mysterious and delicate. People believed that lying down right after eating could suffocate you or make your humors turn against one another. Upright sleep, they thought, helped food settle properly, prevented choking, and let your breath flow more freely. They had no heating beyond the fire, no insulation beyond their cloaks and faith. The fire, banked with ash, would fade by midnight, and waking up cold and coughing was all too common. Sleeping sitting up with the head higher than the chest was believed to keep the lungs clear, especially in an era where illness lurked in every corner. Pneumonia, fevers, and bad airs were blamed for sudden deaths, and no one took the night lightly. That fear seeped into everything. Children were told to stay away from sleepwalkers, for they might be possessed. People hung herbs like lavender or rue near the bed, hoping the scent would keep away nightmares or spirits. And prayers were whispered before the eyes closed, not for rest, but for safe return come morning. Even the rhythm of sleep was different. People didn't sleep once through the night. Instead, they often had what scholars call segmented sleep, 2 periods with a quiet wakeful hour in between. After the first sleep, they might rise to stoke the fire, whisper a prayer, or even visit a neighbor. Then they'd return for the second half, again in their seated position, wrapped in blankets, whispering good night to the darkness. So, next time you lie back in your soft bed and stretch your legs beneath clean sheets, remember the flickering hearth, the whispering wind, the tight blankets around upright shoulders, and the fear, subtle, constant, that to sleep too deeply, too flatly, too completely, might invite something that doesn't return with the dawn. And this was just the beginning, because how people slept was only one part of how they survived the dark, uncertain hours of the medieval night. As the last embers faded beneath the hearth's gray ash, the village around Thomas and Agnes fell into the heavy stillness of night, but the silence was never truly complete. Beyond the cottage walls, dogs barked faintly at shapes they couldn't see, owls called across distant hedgerows, and the wooden beams above the bed groaned softly in the cold, as if remembering every storm they had endured. Sleep was not just a necessity, it was a ritual, woven into beliefs as deep as the roots of the oaks surrounding the village. Even the act of preparing for sleep was layered with meaning. Before resting, Thomas had removed the iron nail he kept tucked in his belt during the day and placed it near the doorframe. He didn't fully understand why, no one truly did, but his father had done the same, and the priest once said iron could repel wicked spirits. The nail was small and blackened with age, but it held a power beyond its size. Agnes, on the other hand, had quietly placed a sprig of rosemary under their shared pillow. Its scent sharp, almost medicinal, believed to guard dreams from wandering too far into the dark. And this was how fear made itself comfortable in ordinary moments. Silent, accepted, never questioned aloud. But it wasn't only fear that shaped how they slept. The sitting posture also allowed for flexibility. Nights were not one long block of rest, but punctuated by short awakenings, small moments of consciousness. People would wake naturally a few hours after first falling asleep. This period was called the watch, and it was oddly productive. Some used this time to pray, others to whisper quietly with loved ones, to stoke the hearth, or tend to animals. Occasionally, neighbors might visit one another in the deep of night, sharing a drink or conversation by candlelight. It was an accepted part of the rhythm of life. A time when the village slept and half-slept, as if the boundary between dreams and waking had thinned like the frost on window panes. No clocks ticked in these homes. Time was measured by the stars, by the change in the cold, or by the depth of the darkness. The moon, when it was visible, gave shape to the yard and cast ghostly lines across dirt paths. But on moonless nights, it was a different world. The blackness was thick and endless, and children were warned not to stare out the windows for too long, lest something stare back. In this world of quiet rules and whispered warnings, even the furniture took on special meaning. The bed, if it could be called that, was not the soft, private retreat we know today. In many households, the entire family shared one large sleeping area. Privacy was unknown and modesty a luxury. The parents, children, and sometimes even visiting relatives or neighbors huddled together for warmth and safety. The heat from bodies, pressed together under woolen covers or fur cloaks, was often the only thing that held back the cold that crept in from every crack in the wall. And still, they did not lie flat. Even the act of reclining was controlled, carefully moderated. The head must stay above the heart. That was what the old women said, and what the priests quietly confirmed. The heart was sacred. If you let it fall below the rest of your body, evil might pool there, or your breath might stop, or you might drift too far into sleep and never come back. These beliefs were not held only by peasants or villagers. Nobles in castles with stone walls and feather beds also obeyed these rules. Some even had custom-made bed chairs, part throne, part cushioned frame, that allowed them to sleep in a seated position, propped by bolsters, with ornate carvings above their heads. It was fashionable and, perhaps more importantly, spiritual. Books from that time, handwritten by monks with aching fingers, included guidance on sleep. Some warned against sleeping after sunrise. It made the mind dull and the limbs heavy. Others advised against napping during the day, as demons were believed to whisper more easily to the half-conscious. Yet others claimed that dreams were messages sent from beyond, glimpses into divine mysteries or demonic temptations, and that the position of the body shaped the purity of those dreams. Thomas, of course, couldn't read. Few in his village could. But stories filtered down through sermons, tavern talk, or even traveling musicians, turning knowledge into legend. They spoke of a man who slept flat and woke with half his body paralyzed. Of a woman who dared to nap on her back and never woke at all. Of a child who rolled onto his stomach and was found the next morning pale and still, lips blue, breath gone. There was no science to confirm or deny these tales. No explanations beyond what the eye could see and the heart could fear. And in a world where medicine was uncertain, illness common, and death never far, fear was a kind of wisdom. Their food, too, shaped how they slept. Supper was usually simple. Pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, sometimes flavored with a bit of lard or onion. Meat was rare and considered heavy. It sat in the stomach like a stone, especially in winter. People believed that what you ate determined how you slept. Spices were seen as heating the body, pepper, ginger, even mustard, and should not be consumed at night unless one wished for restless dreams. Drink was another matter. Ale was common, brewed weak, and often consumed in place of water, which was frequently unsafe. A mug of warm ale or watered-down wine was thought to settle the stomach and calm the nerves. But too much, and one risked seeing strange visions or wandering in their sleep. So they watched their intake. They timed their meals. They prepared their beds with care and sat, upright, still, with the kind of patience modern people have long forgotten. Their world was slower, heavier, filled with silence that carried meaning. And yet, even in all this stillness, there were moments of connection. A touch on the arm beneath the blankets, a whispered memory, the soft rhythm of someone else's breathing, the warmth of another body close by. They were not always comfortable, but they were not entirely alone. And this balance of fear, belief, habit, and necessity shaped how they slept. Not simply because they wanted to, but because everything around them, from the teachings of the church to the whispers of the wind, told them it was the only safe way. They slept sitting up, not by chance, not by accident, but because the night, to them, was never just darkness. It was alive. The air inside the cottage would grow colder as the night wore on. With no insulation and only the memory of the fire's warmth, the temperature dropped steadily, creeping in through the floorboards and slipping beneath doorways like a silent intruder. People didn't simply sleep. They braced themselves against the hours between midnight and dawn, wrapping scarves around their necks, rubbing their hands together beneath coarse linen, whispering half-conscious prayers as if the wind itself were listening. In the middle of this frigid quiet, Thomas might wake, just barely, his body shifting slightly, one eye fluttering open to glimpse the glowing coals in the hearth. He wouldn't sit up, he already was, but he might readjust the blanket around his chest, or shift his weight to ease the ache in his shoulders. And in that small movement was a recognition that this was not strange or disruptive. This was expected. The first sleep had ended. Now came the watch. This in-between time wasn't considered insomnia, nor was it seen as a problem. It was simply part of the natural rhythm. Monks in stone monasteries experienced it too, using the hours for their midnight prayers, their feet cold against damp flagstone as they filed into dark chapels, chanting psalms by candlelight. In the countryside, The villagers, though less disciplined, followed the same cycle, their lives in quiet harmony with the passage of stars overhead. During the watch, some people would quietly talk. Husbands and wives might reflect on the day. Parents might check on children, tucking the blanket higher over their shoulders. Sometimes, if the fire was still warm enough, they'd rise and sit beside it, warming their hands, eating a small piece of bread or drinking a bit of warm ale, then returning to their upright place beneath the covers. This midnight wakefulness was not disruptive. It was familiar, almost gentle. Others used the time to pray. Prayer was woven into everything, not only in the chapels but at home, quietly, with heads bowed and mouths barely moving. There were specific prayers for sleep, for safety through the night, for protection from nightmares. Spirits believed to ride the chest and suffocate the sleeper if they were not properly guarded. These weren't simply figures of speech. People believed them as real as the cold, and to sleep fully flat was to open yourself to them, to lay yourself vulnerable to their invisible weight. The dream world, too, was taken seriously. Dreams were not dismissed as nonsense. They were messages and sometimes warnings. People believed that what you saw in sleep could reflect your sins, your fears, or your future. The way you positioned your body, the purity of the air, and even the direction your bed faced could influence the kind of visions that came to you. Many turned their beds to the east. It was a sacred direction. Toward the rising sun, toward Jerusalem, toward rebirth. Sleeping upright and facing east was thought to guard the soul, to encourage peaceful dreams, and to ensure that, should death come in the night, one would face the light. These weren't passing customs. They were part of a cosmic map that everyone understood, even if no one had seen it drawn. Some stories said that angels passed through houses at night. Others warned of wandering spirits, attracted to warmth and breath. Windows were often shuttered not just for warmth, but to keep the night out, both the cold and whatever else might be moving through it. It was said that if you heard scratching on the door, you should not answer, no matter what voice called your name. Agnes had once told her daughter, in a voice barely above a whisper, that a woman in a nearby village had laid down flat to rest one night and woke unable to speak, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. They said she had seen something in her dreams that she was never meant to see, and though she lived for many more days, she never spoke again. Whether the story was true didn't matter. What mattered was that the risk seemed real. Medicine, such as it was, reinforced these beliefs. The body was made of humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and each had to be balanced. Sitting up helped preserve that balance. Lying down might let bile rise, or phlegm settle in the lungs. Doctors, those few who existed, advised the rich to sleep upright, and their words filtered down through servants, through midwives, through traveling merchants. And so the practice spread. Not everyone had a bed. In fact, most did not. Beds were valuable and passed down through families, treasured like heirlooms. Those who had no proper beds slept on benches, sacks of straw, or even beside the hearth. The elderly often sat upright in chairs, wrapped in shawls, rocking gently as they dozed. They would rarely lie down completely. Even as their bones ached and their backs curved with age, they maintained the tradition, not only because of belief, but because it was all they had ever known. Children learned by watching. They watched their parents sleep sitting up. They learned how to arrange the blanket so it wouldn't fall, how to prop the knees slightly, how to tuck a folded cloth behind the back for support. By the time they were old enough to sleep on their own, they already knew. There was no need to explain. Upright sleep was simply the way things were done. Even inns and travelers' lodgings were arranged for this. In many rural taverns, guests didn't have beds at all, but wooden benches lined with coarse blankets, or shared sleeping spaces where several men would sit against the wall, shoulder to shoulder, their cloaks pulled tight and their eyes closing slowly as the fire burned low. The idea of lying flat among strangers would have seemed vulnerable, too exposed, too close to the state of death. And there was another reason, whispered but never written. It was said that spirits of the dead walked at night, searching for those who mimicked their posture. To lie down as the dead do was to invite confusion. The spirit might not understand that you were still alive. It might linger, or worse, it might take you with it. So they sat upright, in fear, in faith, in tradition. And in doing so, they passed through the darkness with one eye still half open, never fully surrendered to the sleep they needed, and yet surviving it night after night, across generations, across centuries, until the world changed and people forgot. As the night wore on and the watch gave way to the second sleep, the village seemed to drift deeper into itself, like a forest settling after a storm. The air grew still, heavy with dampness and the faint scent of smoke and earth. Inside the cottage, Thomas shifted again, his body trained by years to rest without ever fully surrendering to the pull of unconsciousness. The upright posture was no longer a choice. It was habit, ritual, and inherited instinct all at once. Agnes stirred beside him. She reached over to gently check on the small child curled at the foot of the bed. The child hadn't moved in hours, her breath quiet but steady, and Agnes tucked a fold of fabric higher around her chest. That simple act, so small, so familiar, was repeated in thousands of households across the land. Mothers guarding their children even in sleep, fathers alert to every gust of wind against the door. And beyond the cottages, beyond the hedges and barns and barley fields, the great dark stretched wide and deep. The forests beyond the village were filled with stories of spirits and creatures no one had seen but everyone feared. No one with sense would travel at night unless they had to. The roads were silent, save for the rare clink of a horse's shoe or the rustling of wind-blown leaves. The stars above watched like distant candles in a black cathedral. Inside the manors and castles, the upright posture of sleep took on different forms. In the chambers of the wealthy, large canopied beds stood like ships in the night, draped in velvet or wool, adorned with carvings of saints or beasts. The nobility, too, slept seated or half reclined, bolstered by embroidered pillows or wooden frames angled at the perfect slope. Some even slept with gloves on, to preserve the softness of their hands, or wore perfumed cloths over their faces to purify the air they breathed. But the posture, upright, guarded, remained the same. Even those with access to physicians were advised not to lie flat unless absolutely necessary. The medical texts, translated from Latin and Arabic, warned that sleep too deep and horizontal could draw the humors downward, leading to disease of the chest or a sudden stopping of the heart. These beliefs weren't seen as superstition. They were grounded in the medical understanding of the time, passed from universities to monasteries to midwives. One popular idea was that the body contained vapors that rose and fell. If you lay flat, those vapors might gather in your brain, causing visions, madness, or death. It was better, they said, to sleep elevated, so that the head could remain clear, the breath could rise, and the soul could stay tethered to the body. People believed these things with the same certainty we believe in gravity or germs. They didn't question them, because questioning would mean stepping outside the fragile sense of safety that tradition provided. And so every household, whether of wood or stone, noble or humble, was filled with sleepers arranged not in comfort but in defense. Yet despite all this fear, there was still beauty in the way people prepared for rest. Beds were often adorned with charms. Crosses were carved into headboards. Some families tied sprigs of dried herbs above the bed, believing they brought protection or peaceful dreams. The herbs varied by region: rosemary, mugwort, thyme, but the meaning was shared. Sleep was a passage, and one never walked it unarmed. In homes where literacy was a luxury, families still knew verses by heart. Before closing their eyes, they would whisper words passed down from elders. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, "Bless the bed that I lie on." It was a child's prayer, but adults spoke it too. Not as superstition, but as reassurance, a way to place a barrier between themselves and the unknown. Some even believed that dreams could carry messages from the dead. If a loved one appeared in sleep, it was considered more than memory, it was visitation. And so people listened to their dreams carefully, recalling them upon waking, trying to remember every detail, every word, every expression. Dreams were stitched into the very fabric of waking life, influencing decisions, warnings, and sometimes even guilt. There were those who took special precautions before sleeping. They might wash their hands and feet to purify the body. They might place iron objects near the pillow, or hang bells by the door to ward off wandering spirits. In wealthier homes, cats were often kept indoors, not just to chase mice, but because people believed cats could sense disturbances in the night. Their restlessness was a warning, their stillness, a sign that all was well. And the deeper you look into these practices, the clearer it becomes. Upright sleep was more than posture. It was posture shaped by a world that believed the boundary between life and death was thin, fragile, and easily crossed. This was not a world of certainty. It was a world of signs and symbols, where every creak, every chill, every silence had weight. And the night was the most uncertain place of all. So they slept, but they never truly let go. The second sleep came softer, deeper, but still within the embrace of structure. Around the village, candles had long since burned out, and even the coals were beginning to fade. The people lay in their seated silence, held upright by tradition and fear and faith, drifting slowly through the last hours before dawn. Soon the rooster would call, and the sky would pale, and the day would begin again. But for now, in these final quiet hours, the village rested like a ship in fog, silent, still, and hidden from the storm of waking life. Outside, the sky was still dark, but not quite the black of midnight. A faint hue, neither blue nor gray, had begun to stretch along the edge of the horizon, though no one in the village stirred to see it. The silence was not absolute. A distant crow, unsure whether it was time, let out a questioning call. Somewhere beyond the fields, a fox padded through the underbrush, alert and alone. The world was beginning its slow turn toward morning, but within the cottages, the sleepers remained unmoving, caught in the final descent of their second sleep. Thomas, his head now drooping slightly forward, exhaled through his nose, the breath barely audible in the cold room. His knees were drawn up slightly, as much as the blanket would allow, and his arms rested across his chest, fingers curled, half hidden beneath the folds of coarse wool. Beside him, Agnes shifted in her sleep, the rhythm of her breathing steady, her bonnet slightly askew. In these last hours, dreams came heavier. Not frantic or vivid, but thick, like fog rolling across moorland. They were dreams without clarity, full of strange symbols and slow movements, half-remembered voices, unfamiliar landscapes. People often awoke with the sensation that something had been said or shown, but could not quite recall what it was. And yet, for all their mystery, these dreams were a kind of comfort. If the night had passed without visitations, without trembling, without waking to gasps or sweats, it was considered a good sign, a blessing even. There were nights when that wasn't the case. Some mornings, villagers would speak in hushed tones about a terrible vision. A child waking in tears, an old man found pale and shaken, unable to describe what he'd seen. The priest would sometimes visit on such days, carrying a small brass censer, swinging it gently through the house, muttering Latin under his breath as the smoke curled into corners and climbed the rafters. These rituals were not seen as dramatic or unusual. They were part of life. Protection did not end with the setting sun. It extended into the hours of sleep, when the soul was most vulnerable and the body was least able to fight. And so they slept sitting up, not only because of fear, but because of what sleep meant. It was not simply rest. It was departure, a temporary leaving of the waking world. And to leave safely, precautions had to be taken. Upright posture kept the soul anchored. It was like tying a small string from the heart to the ribs, keeping it close, just in case. In larger towns, this tradition persisted even among travelers. Inns were rarely private. Most rooms had several occupants, strangers lying side by side on benches or straw mats, their backs against the wall, knees bent, heads drooping, cloaks pulled tight. There was a silent agreement among them. No one lay fully flat. To do so would be to draw attention or suspicion. It was a signal not just of comfort, but of ignorance or arrogance. Those who disregarded tradition were considered reckless at best, cursed at worst. And those who did lie flat, usually the very ill, were given special prayers. The bed was straightened, candles were lit, neighbors came and went, quietly, respectfully, as if they already knew the outcome, because lying down meant surrender. And surrender was not something taken lightly. In homes like Thomas and Agnes's, however, no one spoke of such things in daylight. They had work to do, fields to tend, leather to stitch, food to prepare. The weight of sleep, with all its shadows and whispers, was something to be carried quietly, tucked away like a folded letter at the bottom of a drawer. Yet the remnants of the night stayed with them. A look passed between husband and wife at the mention of a strange dream. A pause before opening a shutter in the early morning light. The deliberate way a blanket was folded, or the quiet touch on a child's hair after waking. These were small gestures, invisible to outsiders, but they carried centuries of meaning. And all the while, the world changed slowly around them. The sun rose higher with each passing day. The church bells rang more frequently. Markets grew. Roads expanded. But the way they slept did not change. Not quickly, not easily, because change in the medieval world was slow, cautious, and often met with resistance. To sleep differently would be to admit that what had come before was wrong or unnecessary, and that was unthinkable. The ancestors had slept this way. Their parents had too, and the dangers of the night had not vanished. In fact, the night had not changed at all. It still brought the same silence, the same invisible presence, the same need to be careful. And so, as dawn's light crept across the wooden floor, catching the edge of the iron pot near the hearth and the straw broom leaning in the corner, the sleepers remained still, not yet ready to rise, not yet ready to return. The second sleep was deep, and to disturb it was to risk severing the last fragile connection between safety and the darkness that had just passed. Eventually, someone in the village would stir. A child would wake first, perhaps nudging a cat from their feet. A woman would rise to prepare the fire, her fingers stiff in the morning air. A man would stretch his arms slowly, the aches of seated sleep familiar but bearable. But not yet, for now the silence held. It would not be until the full light of the sun slipped through the slats in the shutters that life would begin again. The upright sleepers, bound by fear and tradition, would open their eyes, stretch their legs, and step once more into the waking world, never quite forgetting the place they had just returned from. A place made not of dreams, but of darkness and discipline, of centuries-old customs, and of a belief so deeply embedded it no longer needed to be spoken aloud. And while the nighttime streets were eerily silent, the world inside medieval homes remained alive in quiet rituals. You might think people went to bed as we do now, but the truth is that many didn't even fully lie down. In fact, sitting upright while sleeping wasn't just common, it was encouraged, even essential for many. But why? Let's start with the simplest answer: fear. The fear of death in sleep was very real. Many believed that lying flat invited the angel of death, or worse, demons. Especially for the poor who lived cramped together in single-room huts. The bed wasn't a private space, nor was it always safe. Sleeping upright was not only practical but seen as a way to avoid choking in the night or being possessed by evil spirits that supposedly entered through the mouth during deep slumber. Their superstitions were not light tales, they were rules to live by. But there's more, especially in the cities. Houses were often damp and cold, and the hearth was the only source of warmth, centrally located in the room. To stay close to it, people slept on benches or chairs arranged near the fire. These weren't comfy lounge chairs. They were straight-backed, sometimes wooden structures with no cushioning at all. A thick woolen blanket might cover your legs, maybe a fur over your shoulders. But comfort wasn't the goal, warmth and survival were. Sitting meant keeping your head away from floor drafts and your lungs clear from the moist chill that settled at night. Even the wealthier classes weren't entirely spared from the upright sleeping position. Their beds were elaborate and raised, sometimes curtained on all sides to preserve heat. But it was common to sleep propped up with bolsters, huge cushions made of feathers, often perfumed. They might recline at an angle, never flat on their backs. Physicians of the era advised that sitting up aided digestion and prevented vapors from rising to the brain, which could cause madness or death in sleep, or so they claimed. It was a mix of flawed science and religious belief, tangled together and passed as law. And then there was illness, plague, colds, fevers, coughing. It was all part of daily life. If someone in your household was sick, sitting up was simply practical. It helped the lungs, prevented vomiting. It made you less likely to be disturbed by the constant movement of others on a shared bed. Entire families might rotate shifts between sitting sleep and lying rest, depending on health and age. In some cases, the head of the family might sleep upright, while children and the elderly lay flat on sacks of straw or hay. So what did these people do before sleep? As they adjusted their bodies to the creaks of their stiff-backed chairs and wrapped woolen cloaks tight around them, some prayed silently. Some mumbled to themselves, recounting the day's events. Others reached for small clay cups of ale or hot broth, yes, even before bed. It was thought to warm the blood. They didn't brush their teeth, of course, but a clove might be chewed for fresh breath, and dried lavender sometimes tucked beneath clothing to keep the lice away. Children were often told stories, not fairy tales like we know, but grim warnings of shadowy creatures that lurked in corners or tales of saints who protected good sleepers. These stories were less entertainment, more obedience training. Stay still or the night hag will find you. Don't lie flat or your soul might slip out of your mouth. And so they stayed sitting. Candles flickered. Smoke drifted lazily upward. The wind howled outside. And within these small spaces, time slowed down. The night wasn't for deep sleep, it was for half sleep. Light dozing, ears open. People would wake in the middle of the night, not by accident, but by design. There was a concept called first sleep and second sleep. A few hours of upright rest, followed by a waking period in the dead of night. During this pause, people would think, talk softly, even pray, then return to another few hours of sitting slumber. It was as if sleep itself was broken into shifts, not the solid block of unconsciousness we expect today. Even their dreams were different, or so they believed. Dreams seen while sitting were thought to be less corrupted, more truthful. Dreams while lying flat, often blamed on demonic influence. These were times when dreams and reality blurred. The mind was not a tool of science, but a vessel, one that could easily be influenced by spirits, angels, or devils. As we move further into the night, the silence grows heavier. The candle burns lower. The seated figures, huddled in the cold, sway slightly as sleep overtakes them in slow waves. Their world, filled with soot and superstition, sickness and silence, rests in these strange poses, upright and alert, ever afraid of what the night might bring. And you begin to wonder, would you have dared to sleep any other way? The rooms of the 14th century were hushed after nightfall, lit only by the occasional flicker of a tallow candle, its flame dancing weakly against the chill. It was not simply the fear of disease or supernatural superstition that kept people upright in their sleep. It was the way homes were built, the air they breathed, and the furniture they had. Most households, especially in towns and smaller villages, didn't have beds as we know them. Instead, there were benches, trunks, and wooden frames with straw-filled sacks that could barely be called mattresses. A full-length bed, big enough to stretch out, was a rare luxury reserved for the wealthy and the clergy. Even among the privileged, the bedchamber was often a shared space, sometimes with servants, relatives, or visiting travelers. Privacy was a concept still centuries away from being invented. A curtain canopy could offer a shred of it, but most simply wrapped themselves in heavy woolen cloaks or animal pelts and settled onto the bed in a sitting or semi-reclined position, propped against carved headboards or bolsters stuffed with hay and herbs. Herbs were an important detail. They weren't just for seasoning food or masking the stench of the streets. Lavender, chamomile, and rue were tucked inside pillows or scattered around the room. People believed they could repel pests, calm the nerves, and offer spiritual protection. In a world where sickness came without warning and medicine was more prayer than science, anything that offered hope was embraced without hesitation. Evenings were quiet but not entirely silent. In towns, the sound of distant voices would echo from taverns long after the sun set. In the countryside, the howling wind was occasionally joined by wolves or the hoot of an owl. Farmers might whisper prayers to Saint Vitus for restful dreams, or murmur tales to their children about spirits that haunted those who slept too deeply. Meals played their part too. Heavy stews, thickened with barley or millet, were eaten in the early evening. These meals sat dense in the belly, often making people drowsy. But instead of lying flat, which they believed would cause indigestion or even death by choking, many preferred to remain seated upright after dinner, dozing in chairs near the fire. It was not only tradition, it was survival. People feared that laying flat would cause vapors or bad humors to rise from the stomach and poison the brain. Medical understanding at the time suggested that one's health was a delicate balance of four humors, and sleep could disrupt that balance if approached carelessly. Clothing wasn't removed for sleep either. People often slept fully dressed or wore simple linen shifts, especially during the cold seasons, which, in medieval Europe, could be unforgiving. There were no central heating systems. A hearth or brazier might provide some warmth, but only for those closest to it. Families often huddled together for warmth, children crammed between parents, elders tucked under spare blankets or sheepskins. Lice and fleas were accepted as an inevitable part of life, so the itch of parasites became part of the nightly routine, scratched absent-mindedly in the half-sleep that came from sitting upright in a stiff wooden chair. Entertainment before sleep was humble and often religious. A short psalm, a whispered prayer, or the recitation of a story, sometimes from the Bible, sometimes from local legends. Candles were expensive, and oil even more so, so darkness fell not just outside but within. People's bodies adapted to the dark. Eyes adjusted, ears grew sensitive. Dreams came quickly, sometimes influenced by the scents in the room or the weight of the day's labor. And if one awoke in the middle of the night, as many did during what they called the first sleep, it wasn't alarming. Waking after a few hours and staying up for a short while was common. They would stoke the fire, relieve themselves, pray again, or even visit a neighbor quietly. Some might slip outside to check on livestock or sip from a clay mug of ale or watered wine. Then, without much fuss, they'd return to their seat or bedroll, resume the same posture, and drift off again for their second sleep. This broken sleep pattern and upright posture might sound uncomfortable to us now, but to them it was simply the way things had always been. No one questioned it. The dangers of the flat position, the influence of the stars, the pulse of the body's humors, all these threads wove together a tapestry of belief, habit, and necessity that guided the medieval way of rest. And as the flickering candle finally guttered out, casting the room into shadow, the medieval sleeper slumped forward just a little more, arms crossed, mouth slightly open, dreaming not of modern beds but of the small comforts, a warm hearth, a full belly, and the distant promise of spring. By the time the clock struck midnight in a medieval village, though few would know the hour precisely, as mechanical clocks were rare and largely reserved for monasteries, life in the household had already settled into a strange rhythm of semi-wakefulness and shallow sleep. Families huddled together in one room, most likely a smoky, drafty hall with a hearth that had long since turned to embers. The night watch outside might still pace the streets if you lived in a town, but for peasants, danger often came from within the dark. Fleas, rats, strange dreams, and the unknown. Now, let's return to the question that keeps nagging us. Why did they sleep sitting up? Earlier, we mentioned that fear of death, superstition, and practicality all contributed to this bizarre posture. But we haven't yet spoken about one of the most overlooked reasons: the furniture. Chairs were rare and usually reserved for people of status. The average home had stools, chests, or benches. Beds, if you could call them that, were often short, more like wide benches with straw-filled mattresses, if you were lucky. Many sleeping platforms were simply wooden boards raised slightly off the ground, and sometimes even just the floor with a rush mat. People didn't necessarily lie flat because their beds didn't allow for it comfortably. Add in shared sleeping arrangements, husband, wife, children, possibly grandparents or a servant, and the idea of everyone stretching out flat becomes almost comical. Sitting up, leaning back against a wall or a headboard, with knees bent and a blanket tucked around, made sense. And if you think this sounds uncomfortable, imagine doing it with two other people pressed against you, the room reeking of sweat, garlic, and smoke, while chickens clucked softly in the corner because yes, livestock often shared the same room. It's at this point in the story we must talk about another crucial piece of this lifestyle puzzle: segmented sleep. In the 14th century, people didn't sleep in one long stretch like we do now. Instead, they practiced what's now called biphasic sleep. The first sleep started shortly after sundown and lasted a few hours. Then people would wake, often for an hour or two, and use this time for a surprising range of activities. Some prayed. Prayer books and candlelit psalms filled the quiet hours. Some even visited neighbors if they lived nearby. Others engaged in sex, especially married couples, believing the second sleep was the time God favored for conception. Doctors of the time even wrote about this, claiming the body was better prepared during the interval between sleeps. And yes, some simply stared at the fire or thought about the next day's tasks, listening to the house creak and the dog's bark in the distance. This natural break in the middle of the night was so common it had a name in many languages. In English, it was simply called first sleep and second sleep. The French referred to it as premier sommeil and sommeil second. Literature of the time casually references these terms. It wasn't weird, it was expected, and sitting upright made the transition between sleep and wakefulness more fluid. But this wasn't always a matter of personal choice. In towns and cities, the architecture itself often encouraged the seated position. Narrow buildings meant small rooms. Many homes were 2 or 3 stories high, but each floor might only be 1 or 2 small rooms. If your family lived on the 3rd floor with a sloped ceiling, you physically couldn't lie down flat without cramming into a corner. Also, the fire. The hearth was central to warmth and protection. Sleeping close to it made sense in winter, but smoke from wood or peat fires often choked low-lying spaces. Sitting up kept your head above the smoke line, especially in buildings without chimneys, which were not widespread until later centuries. Even if you were lucky enough to have a canopy bed, yes, the luxurious curtain kind, it wasn't just decoration. Those heavy drapes kept out cold air and prying eyes, but also trapped heat and smoke. A seated sleeper could part the curtain slightly, allowing fresh air in and smoke out, without giving up warmth. And of course, there's the matter of danger. Let's not forget that for many people, going to sleep at night was a vulnerable act. Night raids, fires, sickness, wild dogs, even demons, at least in the minds of the people, meant that lying flat was a kind of surrender. Seated sleep, eyes half closed, heart slightly alert, felt safer. A sleeping position ready to awaken at the first noise or draft. It was less like sleep, more like retreat. But this strange way of sleeping wasn't just a rural or poor person's phenomenon. Even in castles, among nobility and clergy, people often slept propped up with multiple pillows or bolsters, resembling what we might call a reclining rest. Medical advice from the time warned that lying flat could bring too much blood to the head, cause bad dreams, or invite the devil to sit on your chest, a sensation we now associate with sleep paralysis. Physicians, those educated in the works of Galen and Hippocrates, believed that digestion, circulation, and even moral virtue were improved by sleeping upright. It was said to prevent the pooling of humors in the body, especially black bile, which caused melancholia. Sitting up wasn't just tradition, it was medicine. Even monks in monasteries, who lived austere lives, often slept in stone cells on benches with their backs against the wall and their heads bowed. Some were forbidden from lying fully down at all, believing sleep was too indulgent. Sleep, after all, was dangerously close to sloth, a sin. As dawn approached, the rhythm of the household changed once more. The fire was rekindled, chickens stirred, bread dough was uncovered and placed near the hearth to rise. And the seated sleeper would often wake already partially upright, ready to start the day with less stiffness and less shock to the body. The bell would toll, the cock would crow, and the cycle would begin again. But we're still just scratching the surface. There's something deeper to this, something psychological. What if this posture wasn't just a habit or necessity, but a reflection of how people in the 14th century saw the world itself? Let's keep going. By now, the idea of sleeping upright might no longer feel so strange, especially when you understand that the entire medieval world was arranged around a very different rhythm of life, one that did not prioritize comfort as we define it today, but instead survival, structure, and meaning in every action. As night fell in a typical 14th century household, families would gather around the hearth not just for warmth, but also to share stories, knit wool, carve utensils, or simply sit in silence, often in the dim flicker of a tallow candle or oil lamp. With no clocks ticking or screens glowing, People often went to bed not by a schedule but by the slow pull of darkness and routine. Let's step inside a peasant's cottage on a damp evening. The walls are timber and wattle, patched with clay and straw. Smoke curls lazily from the hole in the thatched roof where a chimney would someday be invented. The scent of stewed onions, leeks, and turnips clings to every beam and blanket. A mother, with her hair tied under a linen coif, rocks slightly in a carved wooden chair near the fire, whispering the last lines of a prayer while darning a woolen sock. The father, sun-worn and silent, sharpens a blade by lantern light. Their children, wrapped in hand-stitched tunics, lean against their parents or each other, eyelids fluttering. But no one fully lies down yet. They will sleep, yes, but not in the full sense we know. For them, the bed was a shared, almost communal structure. Imagine a wooden frame with rope supports that had to be tightened each night, from which we get the phrase, sleep tight. On it, a mattress stuffed with straw or rags, covered in itchy wool blankets or sometimes even old cloaks. And here's where the posture comes in. Beds were typically short, and not just because people were allegedly shorter. Many of these beds were deliberately designed for semi-upright sleeping. Why? For several reasons. For one, people believed lying flat was associated with death. Corpses were laid out horizontally, and in an age obsessed with omens, symbolism, and superstition, sleeping in the same position as a dead man might tempt fate or evil spirits. Secondly, upright posture was considered better for digestion, especially after the kinds of meals they often ate: heavy, greasy stews, thick grains, beer, and salted meats. Physicians who followed a mix of classical Greek humors and folk remedies advised against lying down fully after eating, fearing that it might lead to suffocation or nightmares caused by vapors rising from the stomach to the brain. The wealthy, too, often propped themselves up to sleep. In castle chambers, feather beds were arranged against stone walls, layered with furs and linen. But even then, nobility often reclined in a half-sitting pose. Pillows and bolsters were propped behind their backs, sometimes stacked upon wooden headboards or wedges. In illuminated manuscripts, you can sometimes find depictions of lords and ladies resting in bed while still adorned in caps and loose robes, seated more than lying, discussing matters by candlelight or hearing stories from minstrels. This posture also allowed for a rather unique medieval sleep pattern, what we now call segmented sleep. Rather than sleeping in one solid 8-hour stretch, people often went to bed early, rose during the night for an hour or more, then returned to bed again until dawn. During that wakeful period in the middle of the night, called the watch, many sat upright, prayed, made love, tended to animals, or stoked the fire. This in-between moment was viewed as peaceful, reflective, and oddly sacred. Let's return to our peasant family. Around midnight, the embers glow low. One child stirs and sits up, yawning. The mother, eyes closed, still sits supported by a pillow tied to the bedpost behind her. The father, only half reclined, reaches for his cup, perhaps still containing some watered ale. Outside, an owl hoots in the darkness. The village sleeps, but not deeply and not flat. The seated position also helped in case of illness. With disease rampant and no real cure for things like tuberculosis, congestion, or pneumonia, sleeping upright allowed for easier breathing. Coughing fits at night were common, and parents might prop up a sick child to help ease their lungs, using straw bundles or wooden cradles. In monasteries, monks, especially older ones, sometimes slept in their robes, seated upright against cold stone, out of discipline and devotion, believing lying down too comfortably invited laziness or sin. And there was one more subtle reason: fear. Fear of thieves, fear of fire, fear of wolves howling in the woods, of spirits that might drift through a door left cracked open. To sleep too deeply was to invite danger. To sit up, even in sleep, was a form of vigilance. It's no wonder, then, that chairs, stools, and makeshift beds were arranged around the hearth like sentries, and people slumbered lightly, ears attuned to the creak of wood or the call of an animal. In towns and cities, the sleeping conditions were often worse. Poor families sometimes lived several to a room, the scent of rotting food mixing with sweat and soot. Upright sleeping became necessity, not choice. In inns or taverns, strangers might share a bench or corner of a bed, staying mostly vertical, leaning against a wall or each other. Privacy was rare. Comfort was secondary. Upright sleeping was as much about space as superstition. And yet, people adapted. They found rhythm in discomfort, meaning in habit, warmth in proximity. Let yourself picture this world for a moment. The flicker of firelight dancing on plaster walls, the gentle weight of wool on your shoulders, the creaking of straw as you settle into your seated slumber. The world outside is cold, uncertain, and dangerous. But here, in this moment, you are safe, seated, and wrapped in the rhythm of centuries past. They slept sitting up, not because they liked it, but because the world around them left little choice. In the flickering glow of rushlight candles, the rooms remained half-shrouded in darkness. The average home had no chimney, no safe hearth, just a central fire pit with smoke curling its way up through a hole in the roof. The air was thick and sour. Inhaling too deeply while lying down could choke a person in their sleep, especially the very young and the very old. Parents often cradled their infants upright through the night. Even in manors, with their grander halls and tapestries, the stone walls wept cold. The dampness never quite left you. A commoner's bed, if they had one, was no more than a wooden frame filled with straw and dry leaves, sometimes mixed with lavender or chamomile to mask the mold. Mattresses were stitched from linen and stuffed with anything from horsehair to feathers, but they flattened quickly and attracted lice. To lie flat meant pressing your face into that filth, and it was often safer, for your lungs and your skin, to remain propped up. They used bolsters, ropes, wooden headrests, even sacks of grain to create a sloped posture, legs stretched out, spine tilted. To you and me, it might look like they'd simply dozed off while waiting, but the fear ran deeper than smoke or vermin. There was a long-held belief, especially among those influenced by church teachings, that lying flat was too close to death. After all, that was how the dead were laid to rest. Arms at the side, spine straight, toes pointed. To sleep like that was to invite death's hand. Some even said the devil might mistake you for a corpse and snatch your soul while you dreamed. Old women, with their whispering tongues, warned young girls to never lie flat lest they fall prey to night spirits. For them, posture wasn't comfort. It was survival. And then there were the clothes. Unlike today, people didn't change into pajamas. Night clothes were for the very wealthy or the very ill. Most peasants and tradesfolk slept in the same garments they wore during the day, sometimes even with shoes on, in case they needed to flee in the dark. Outer garments were thick, wool tunics, linen shifts, coarse cloaks. Undressing wasn't just unnecessary. It was dangerous. The air could freeze a person where they lay. And in houses where many slept side by side, parents, children, sometimes even the neighbors' children, all upright, all bundled in wool, the scent was unforgettable. Sharp, human, living. By the hearth, a pot of dried beans or a stew from yesterday might still be warming. People woke frequently, adjusting the logs, stoking the coals. A few sips of warm ale or cider helped settle the stomach before slipping back into a seated slumber. Some drank herbal infusions, valerian, hops, mugwort, passed down through generations. It wasn't for taste. It was for dreams. Night was not silent. Owls shrieked. Dogs barked at nothing. Wolves howled far off, echoing through the trees. The wind clawed through gaps in wooden walls. And worst of all, the bell. Towns had bells that rang in the darkest hours, warnings of fire, of invaders, of sickness. A single toll could wake the whole village. Sleep had to be light. Sitting up made it easier to wake, to listen, to run. Even intimacy was different. Couples might sit facing each other under heavy wool blankets, whispering, warming one another without removing much. The risks were too high. They'd share secrets, recite psalms, trade gossip. Physical closeness was more about surviving the night than romance. Children huddled together like kittens. Elders rocked slowly, wrapped in every scrap of fabric they owned. Stories were told softly, mostly out of superstition, to keep the spirits calm, to ward off bad dreams. No shouting, no laughter, just whispers, sometimes a prayer, and the crackling fire. And then there were the watchmen. Not everyone got to sleep. In cities like London or Bruges, a town crier or watchman would pace the streets, staff in hand, calling out the hours. 1 o'clock and all's well. They'd chant into the dark, their voice swallowed by fog. But if a thief skulked past or a fire sparked in a bakery, they were the first line of defense. Their families slept upright too, waiting for the knock at the door, for the call to help. Everything about the medieval night was built around awareness. You never let your guard down. Even in dreams, you remained halfway in the world. And yet, despite all this fear, there was a strange kind of peace to it. The firelight danced. The wind hummed its ancient lullaby. And the people, wrapped in their sitting sleep, drifted gently in and out of dreams, tethered to the waking world by posture and tradition. But the most fascinating part? They didn't just sleep once per night, and that changes everything. The medieval night was a cycle of waking and sleeping, not the solid, uninterrupted rest we expect today. Historians have uncovered diaries, court records, and even literature from the 14th century that mention the first sleep and second sleep as natural, expected parts of the night. People woke during those hours not by accident but by design, and many made use of that waking time. Imagine yourself waking quietly in a dimly lit chamber, still propped up on cushions or sitting on a bench by the hearth. Outside, the village is silent except for the distant bark of a dog or the rustling of leaves. Inside, you might perform simple rituals to ease your mind and body. Some would pray quietly, asking for protection through the rest of the night. Others would share whispered conversations with family members, discussing matters too private for daytime ears. It was also common for people to tend to household chores. In cold months, embers were stirred, fires rekindled, and water fetched for cooking or washing. Some would visit neighbors, passing quietly through shadowed streets, exchanging news or comforting one another in shared hardship. The night silence was a canvas for human connection and vigilance. This segmented sleep pattern made sitting up all the more practical. Rising from a fully horizontal position was cumbersome, especially without modern mattresses or soft pillows. Sleeping upright meant you could awaken more smoothly and remain alert if needed. And because rooms were often small and shared, movement was limited. Sitting allowed for easier interaction without disturbing others too much. Interestingly, this biphasic sleep influenced culture and even law. Court proceedings or church services sometimes occurred during these night hours. Midnight prayers and vigils aligned with this natural rhythm. Literature and art from the period reference these segmented sleeps and the quiet wakefulness between. Dreams, too, were interpreted differently depending on which part of the night they occurred. Of course, this pattern faded as clocks became widespread and industrialization reshaped daily life. But in the 14th century, it was the norm. And yet, the upright posture wasn't solely about sleep cycles. Physical health, superstition, and architecture all intertwined to create a night unlike our own. One where sitting up to sleep was the safest and most sensible choice. Even today, some cultures maintain forms of upright resting, recalling those ancient instincts. So next time you lie flat in your cozy bed, think back to the 14th century, when sitting up wasn't just a habit, but a shield against the dark. The dawn of the 14th century was not just the start of a new day. It was the moment when centuries-old traditions intertwined with daily necessity, shaping the way people rested and dreamed. To understand why sitting sleep prevailed, we must look deeper into the very architecture of homes and the challenges of medieval life. Medieval houses were often built hastily, from timber frames with walls of wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks and clay. These materials were porous and damp. Even in summer, the interiors were chilly and musty. The winter months were especially cruel, with bitter winds slipping through cracks, snows piling outside, and hearth fires that struggled to keep rooms warm. Because rooms were small, often only 1 or 2 per household, living and sleeping quarters blended. Beds were typically positioned near the hearth for warmth, but too close meant smoke and sparks. Sitting upright was a way to stay near heat while avoiding choking on smoke or inhaling cold drafts. The fire warmed the chest and back, but the head remained elevated above smoke, allowing easier breathing. Ventilation was primitive. Most houses lacked chimneys, so smoke escaped through roof gaps. This meant interiors were often hazy with soot and fumes, making deep sleep risky. The seated posture helped prevent the lungs from filling with smoke during slumber, protecting the sleeper from suffocation. Furthermore, beds were not designed for comfort. They were functional platforms covered with straw or rushes that were replaced infrequently. Mattresses were hard, thin, and often infested with insects. People avoided lying flat to minimize skin irritation and exposure to parasites. Sitting or reclining slightly reduced contact with these irritants and allowed for better circulation in cold environments. The physical discomfort was compounded by spiritual beliefs. Medieval people lived under the shadow of the church's teachings and pervasive superstition. Sleep was seen as a vulnerable state when souls could wander or demons might intrude. The upright posture was thought to anchor the soul, preventing it from drifting away during the night. People believed that lying completely flat was a posture reserved for the dead, so sitting up while sleeping was a symbolic safeguard, a way to distinguish life from death even in rest. This was reinforced by religious practices like praying before bed, burning protective herbs, and hanging charms near sleeping areas. Sleep was not just a biological necessity, it was a sacred ritual. Medical texts from the era reveal that physicians advised patients to sleep propped up to avoid vapors rising from the stomach to the brain, which were believed to cause madness or death. These ideas came from humoral theory, ancient Greek medicine integrated into medieval science, which saw the body as balanced by 4 fluids. Upright sleep was thought to maintain this balance. The social aspect also played a role. Houses often sheltered extended families, with multiple generations sharing cramped quarters. Sleeping upright allowed more people to share limited space without crushing each other or spreading disease. It also facilitated readiness. If a child cried out, or if danger came, a quick response was possible. In castles and monasteries, this habit persisted too. Nobles and clergy slept on feather beds but reclined with bolsters to keep their bodies elevated. Monks sometimes slept sitting upright on benches, out of ascetic discipline, believing that comfort led to spiritual laziness. Even the calendar influenced sleep. In the long, dark winters, nights lasted for many hours. Segmenting sleep with periods of wakefulness and upright rest made these nights more bearable. People would rise, tend to chores, reflect, or pray before returning to bed for a second sleep. In essence, sleeping sitting up in the 14th century was a complex solution to a range of environmental, medical, spiritual, and social challenges. It was neither strange nor uncomfortable to those who lived it. It was simply the way of life. And while today we think of sleep as a private, restful, horizontal act, for our medieval ancestors, it was a communal, guarded, and upright vigil against the unknown. As the years turned slowly in the 14th century, the ways people lived, worked, and slept were intimately connected. To understand why sitting sleep endured, we must also consider the routines that shaped daily life. From dawn until dusk, peasants labored in fields, tended livestock, or wove cloth. Their days were long and exhausting, filled with repetitive tasks that demanded physical strength and endurance. After a hearty meal of pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat, they would prepare for the night. But rest was not a passive act. The family gathered in the main room, near the hearth, where firelight cast shadows on rough walls. Chairs were few, but benches and stools were arranged around the warmth. Heavy wool blankets, woven from sheep raised nearby, were laid out. Before settling down, a quiet ritual might take place. A prayer whispered for protection, a sprig of rosemary placed near the head to ward off nightmares, or a small charm hung by the door. Because beds were rare and often too small, many simply arranged straw mats or bundles of rushes on benches, leaning their backs against walls or cushions. To lie fully flat was uncomfortable and impractical, especially in cold, damp rooms where drafts slipped unseen. This posture, sitting or semi-reclined, allowed for a lighter sleep, where the body remained partially alert. It was a natural response to the environment's threats: cold, pests, sickness, and superstition. In this way, sleep was a shared vigil, a community's defense against the night's dangers. Moreover, the practice of segmented sleep gave meaning to the night's quiet hours. People did not simply passively rest. They actively engaged with the darkness. Some used the time to mend tools, others to discuss plans quietly, and some to reflect on the day's events. The watchful sitting posture facilitated this in-between state, neither fully awake nor deeply asleep. Food and drink played their part in this routine. Ale and cider, staples of medieval life, were consumed late into the evening. They provided warmth and relaxation, but also a reason to sleep upright, as lying down after drinking was thought to cause choking or bad dreams. The presence of animals within living spaces also influenced posture. Chickens, cats, and sometimes even pigs shared rooms, offering warmth but also noise and movement. Sitting up allowed humans to navigate the crowded space without disturbing others or being startled. In wealthier homes, the ritual was more elaborate. Canopied beds with heavy curtains provided privacy and some insulation. Bolsters and pillows propped sleepers at an incline, and aromatic herbs were stuffed in linen sachets. Even so, the upright sleeping position persisted, shaped by medical advice and cultural beliefs. Doctors of the era, guided by the works of Galen and Hippocrates, believed that an upright position improved circulation and digestion. They warned that lying flat could cause vapors to rise, leading to fever or madness. This medical wisdom, combined with superstition and practicality, reinforced the seated posture as the healthiest way to rest. Religious beliefs also played a significant role. The boundary between life and death was thin. Lying flat was associated with death's repose. Sitting up symbolized life's vigilance. Prayers before sleep were common, and some households hung crosses or holy images near the bed. As dawn approached, families would slowly stir from their upright rest, stretching limbs stiff from the night. Fires were rekindled, and the household began to prepare for a new day's labor. Sitting sleep had preserved their strength and guarded their souls through the night's uncertainty. In sum, the 14th century's seated sleep was more than a habit. It was a vital adaptation to a challenging world. A blend of environment, belief, medicine, and social structure shaped how people met the darkness. And it's a reminder that what seems strange or uncomfortable to us today was once the best way to survive and find peace in the night. As the years pressed onward in the 14th century, the practice of sleeping sitting upright remained deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of medieval people. The posture was less a matter of personal comfort and more a response to a confluence of environmental hardships, cultural beliefs, and medical knowledge. One cannot overstate the role that the natural world played in shaping this behavior. Winters were harsh and unforgiving. Snow blanketed the landscape for months, and the biting cold seeped through walls and floors. With no insulation or central heating, the hearth was the heart of the home, both physically and spiritually. Sitting near the fire, even during sleep, was essential to stave off frostbite and hypothermia. Yet proximity to the hearth carried risks, smoke inhalation and the chance of burning. So sitting upright allowed individuals to remain close enough for warmth without the dangers of lying flat in the smoky air. The architecture of medieval homes compounded these challenges. Houses were built from timber frames filled with wattle and daub or stone, often with gaps that let in wind and rain. Chimneys were rare. Most smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or a small opening in the wall. Rooms were low-ceilinged, cramped, and shared by entire families or groups of workers. This scarcity of space meant that sleeping fully reclined was impractical. Sitting or semi-reclined positions allowed more people to share the limited space without encroaching on each other. Medical teachings of the time, largely based on ancient Greek theories, deeply influenced sleep posture. The balance of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was believed to be essential to health. Physicians advised that lying completely flat could disturb this balance, causing an excess of black bile, which was linked to melancholy and death. Sleeping upright was thought to promote the proper flow of humors, improving digestion and preventing disease. In monasteries, the practice had a spiritual dimension as well. Monks, devoted to a life of prayer and discipline, often slept sitting upright or semi-reclined on wooden benches or simple beds. Comfort was seen as a temptation to sloth, a deadly sin. The posture reflected vigilance not only against physical dangers but spiritual ones. To rest in this way was to remain awake in spirit, even as the body found partial rest. Superstition and religious belief interwove tightly with these practical considerations. The dead were laid flat on their backs, arms crossed or at their sides, heads tilted. To imitate this posture in sleep was feared as an invitation to death or demonic visitation. Sitting upright was a living stance, a way to keep one's soul firmly within the body during the vulnerable hours of night. Social dynamics also reinforced this posture. Sleeping in groups meant that alertness was shared. An upright posture enabled quicker response to danger, whether from fire, thieves, or wild animals. Children learned early to settle into this seated rest, sometimes perched on benches or even on their parents' laps. Even the segmented sleep pattern fit naturally with sitting sleep. The interval between first and second sleep was often a time for reflection, prayer, or quiet activity, with individuals sitting up to read psalms, mend clothes, or share hushed conversation. Rising fully from a prone position would have been awkward and disruptive. Sitting sleep eased these transitions. Thus, the sitting sleep of the 14th century was no mere oddity. It was a complex adaptation to the physical realities of medieval life, the medical understanding of the time, and the cultural and spiritual framework that shaped human behavior. It balanced the need for rest with the demands of survival, weaving health, habit, and belief into a single nightly ritual. And while today we stretch out in padded beds, surrounded by warmth and silence, it is worth remembering that for countless centuries, sleep was a shared, upright vigil, guarded by firelight, shadow, and the quiet murmur of prayers. As the 14th century progressed, the reasons for sitting sleep became even more entrenched in daily habits, shaped by the rhythms of life, health, and belief. But beyond the practical and spiritual, there existed an unseen layer, how the mind and body adapted to these conditions, creating a culture where sitting upright to sleep was as natural as breathing. The medieval body, hardened by labor and conditioned by routine, bore the marks of constant movement and strain. Farmers bent over fields, blacksmiths hammered glowing metal, and weavers twisted threads with calloused hands. By night, muscles ached, joints stiffened, and backs bore the weight of the day's toil. Stretching out fully was not always a relief. Instead, sitting up, with legs bent and back supported, offered a gentle release from tension. It allowed the body to rest without surrendering its readiness to wake. Pain management, though primitive, was practiced with herbs and massages. People applied poultices of lavender or rosemary to sore limbs and wrapped themselves in warm blankets. Sitting sleep provided a position that minimized pressure points, allowing for better circulation and less stiffness by morning. Sleeping flat on hard surfaces, by contrast, could exacerbate aches and invite illness. Mental adaptation played a role too. With no artificial lighting, the body's internal clock was governed by natural cycles of light and dark. The mind expected interruptions, moments of wakefulness, and movement. To lie flat and sleep through the night was unfamiliar, even unsettling. Sitting sleep matched this segmented awareness. It allowed for moments of quiet reflection or vigilance without fully waking, a liminal state between consciousness and rest. The church reinforced this mindset. Night was a sacred time for prayer, contemplation, and even penance. Monastic rules often included night vigils, where monks rose from their semi-reclined beds to chant or meditate. Lay people adopted similar habits, lighting candles to say prayers before settling back into their seated rest. The posture symbolized devotion, watchfulness, and humility. Children learned early. Mothers cradled infants upright to soothe colic or ease breathing, a practice still recognized today. Youngsters copied elders, adopting sitting sleep as part of their routine. This posture was woven into lullabies, tales, and customs, becoming a subconscious expectation of rest. Despite all hardships, medieval people found comfort in community. Sleeping close, sharing warmth and safety, offered psychological solace. Sitting upright meant staying connected not only physically but emotionally. The quiet murmur of loved ones, the rustle of blankets, the flicker of candlelight, all created a cocoon against the dark unknown. In town and country alike, life demanded alertness. Fires could start without warning, thieves lurked in alleys, and illness could strike swiftly. The sitting sleeper remained ready, eyes half closed, mind soft but watchful. This vigilance was survival. As the 14th century waned and new technologies and ideas emerged, habits slowly shifted. Beds grew larger, chimneys became common, and the idea of lying flat to sleep gained acceptance. But for centuries, sitting sleep was the rhythm of the night, a quiet dance between necessity and belief. So when you next settle into your soft mattress, surrounded by silence and warmth, consider the generations who rested sitting upright, wrapped in wool and shadow, cradled by firelight, living and dreaming in a world shaped by posture and purpose. In the heart of the 14th century. As candle flames flickered low and shadows stretched long across timbered walls, the night whispered secrets that only the sitting sleeper could hear. While modern beds invite us to sink deeply, here the posture was a bridge between wakefulness and rest, the physical and spiritual, the tangible and mysterious. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, herbs, and damp earth. Fires crackled and hissed, casting warmth on weary bodies. The constant chorus of creaking wood, muffled footsteps, and distant howls painted a soundscape both comforting and unnerving. The sitting sleeper remained alert enough to sense the nuances of the night, when a rat scurried near or when the chill deepened. In a world without modern medicine, illness was a constant shadow. Respiratory ailments, such as consumption and pneumonia, preyed upon the weak. Sitting upright eased breathing, prevented fluids from pooling, and allowed sufferers to find some relief. Families cared for the sick by propping them on bundles of straw or wooden benches, their bodies inclined in that same familiar posture. The practice of sitting sleep became not only cultural but therapeutic. Food and drink before rest were heavy and dense. Meals of pottage, coarse bread, salted meat, and ale filled the stomach but required digestion before sleep could come. Lying flat too soon was believed to cause indigestion or worse, visions, nightmares, or even death. Thus, sitting upright after eating was a time-honored practice to aid digestion and ward off harm. Children, too, absorbed these customs early. Mothers soothed restless infants upright, their gentle rocking a lullaby against the dark. Youngsters learned to settle against wooden backs or cushioned bolsters, their eyes fluttering closed as stories of saints and spirits filled the air. These early experiences cemented sitting sleep as a natural and comforting routine. The Church wove its influence deeply into this fabric. Nighttime prayers, vigils, and rites were not just duties but safeguards against evil. The belief that the soul was vulnerable during sleep drove many to sleep in positions symbolizing life and vigilance. Seated, upright, ready to pray or awaken. Monastic rules often forbade full reclining, linking posture with piety. Communal sleeping spaces fostered bonds and a shared sense of protection. Families huddled close, wrapped in heavy woolens, sharing warmth and security. Sitting upright allowed more to fit within limited space and enabled quick response to threats. It was a posture of connection as much as defense. Through all these layers, environmental, medical, spiritual, and social, the seated sleep of the 14th century was a masterful adaptation to a complex world. It balanced the human need for rest with the ever-present demands of survival and belief. And though centuries have passed, echoes remain. Today, as you lie down in comfort, remember those who sat through the long, dark nights, guarding their souls and bodies in a world shaped by firelight and faith. By the mid-14th century, life in Europe was a tapestry of resilience and hardship, and the nightly ritual of sitting sleep had become deeply embedded across classes and regions. This practice was not simply about physical necessity. It was intertwined with the very worldview of medieval people, reflecting how they understood life, death, and the unseen forces that governed both. Imagine a small village nestled among rolling hills, its thatched roofs blanketed by early autumn mist. Inside a humble home, the family prepares for the night. The eldest daughter carefully places a bundle of dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, and thyme, near the bed to ward off bad dreams and illness. The father stokes the dying embers of the hearth, while the mother gathers wool blankets to keep the chill at bay. As darkness envelopes the landscape, each member finds their place, settling into the seated posture that will cradle their sleep. The household sitting sleep is not static. It's dynamic and responsive. When the youngest child stirs, a parent gently lifts him onto their lap, soothing him upright with soft murmurs and gentle rocking. The posture allows this tender care without the difficulty of lifting or moving a child lying flat in cramped quarters. Throughout the village, this rhythm echoes. Night watchmen patrol the cobbled streets, alert and upright, their silhouettes moving through the mist. Monks in nearby monasteries sit in stone cells, their knees drawn close, reciting silent prayers while dozing lightly. Even merchants, returning from distant markets, find themselves leaning back against walls or chairs, wrapped in cloaks and waking periodically in the night's segmented sleep. The health benefits of this posture, though misunderstood, were real. Upright sleep eased breathing, facilitated digestion, and prevented the pooling of blood that could lead to fainting or worse. Medieval physicians, drawing from ancient texts, recommended sleeping propped up for those with fevers or respiratory troubles. In this way, sitting sleep was both medicine and tradition. Yet, the posture also reflected a profound spiritual vigilance. The medieval mind was steeped in belief that the night was a time when the veil between worlds thinned. Demons, restless spirits, and even the dead were thought to wander. Sleeping upright was a way to remain anchored in the living world, to guard the soul from wandering, and to keep watch against malevolent forces. This vigilance extended beyond the individual. Families often slept clustered together, sharing warmth and safety, their collective watchfulness a bulwark against dangers both physical and supernatural. The posture facilitated quick awakening and movement if needed, whether to respond to a fire, a predator, or a call for help. As dawn approached, the household stirred gently, stretching limbs and rubbing sleep from eyes. The seated sleepers prepared to rise and face a new day of toil. The sitting sleep had preserved their strength, guarded their spirits, and connected them to a world both seen and unseen. In this way, the sitting sleep of the 14th century was far more than a strange custom. It was a complex, living tradition, born of environment, necessity, belief, and community, that shaped how people navigated the darkest hours and found rest amidst uncertainty. As the 14th century drew onward, the sitting sleep tradition was not just a means of rest, but a symbol of the complex interplay between human existence and the natural world's challenges. People understood that their nights were fraught with unseen dangers, and the upright posture was a silent defense, a living barrier against these threats. Consider the daily lives of medieval women, who bore the brunt of household management and child-rearing. Their nights were often restless, filled with the needs of infants and the sick, tending to the fire, or soothing frightened children. Sitting sleep allowed mothers to remain semi-alert, ready to respond at a moment's notice while still gaining rest. The close quarters of their homes meant that multiple generations often slept together, all sharing the sitting posture as a communal comfort and protection. Men, after long days of labor in fields, workshops, or markets, found the upright sleep a way to alleviate the strain of physical toil. The semi-reclined position relieved pressure on backs and joints, offering a gentle reprieve from the hardships of medieval labor. Furthermore, it enabled a quick awakening if duty called during the night, whether to defend against theft or tend to animals. Religious life reinforced these patterns. The Church's teachings emphasized vigilance and humility, discouraging indulgence in comfort. The posture of sitting sleep was seen as a reflection of these virtues, a physical expression of spiritual watchfulness. Monastic communities incorporated periods of wakefulness throughout the night, with monks rising from their benches to chant prayers and meditate, blending rest with devotion. This spiritual dimension extended into popular belief. Many medieval people held that sleeping flat exposed the soul to danger. The upright posture anchored it firmly within the body. To lie flat was to imitate the dead, an act fraught with peril. To sit was to remain among the living, alert and safe. Architectural constraints shaped these practices further. Houses with limited space and poor insulation necessitated a sleeping posture that maximized warmth and minimized exposure to cold drafts and smoke. Beds were scarce and often communal. Sitting allowed more people to share the limited space comfortably and safely. Even the segmented sleep cycle favored sitting sleep. The natural awakening between first and second sleep was a time of reflection, prayer, and quiet activity. Sitting upright facilitated these nocturnal interludes, allowing people to move without disturbing others or fully rousing themselves. The sitting sleep of the 14th century, then, was a multifaceted tradition, a blend of practical adaptation, cultural belief, medical understanding, and spiritual discipline. It was a posture that sustained bodies, guarded souls, and connected communities through the long, uncertain nights. As the centuries passed, new technologies and ideas transformed sleep patterns, but for those who lived in the 14th century, sitting sleep was the rhythm of life after dark, a testament to human resilience and faith. As we delve deeper into the nightly world of the 14th century, it becomes clear that sleeping sitting up was more than habit. It was a way of life shaped by necessity, belief, and the environment. This posture, so foreign to us now, was a carefully balanced response to the challenges faced by medieval people. Daily life was harsh and unpredictable. From dawn's first light, villagers worked tirelessly in fields or workshops, their bodies weary and worn. Returning home as dusk fell, they found only dim candlelight and the lingering chill of the evening. The warmth of the hearth was precious but fleeting, and with no modern insulation or central heating, nights could be bitterly cold. The architecture of their homes influenced sleeping habits greatly. Rooms were small, with low ceilings and thin walls of timber, stone, or wattle and daub. Smoke from the central fire pit filled the air, and without chimneys, the interior often remained smoky and dank. Sleeping fully reclined in such conditions risked suffocation or discomfort. Sitting upright helped mitigate these dangers, allowing smoke to rise above the sleeper's face and improving airflow. Health concerns were paramount. Medical understanding was rooted in humoral theory, with doctors warning against lying flat after eating to avoid dangerous vapors. Respiratory illnesses like tuberculosis were common, and sitting sleep eased breathing, preventing fluids from pooling in the lungs. Families cared for the sick by propping them upright, a practice that naturally extended to the healthy population as preventative. Spiritually, the night was fraught with peril. The medieval mind believed in restless spirits, demons, and other unseen forces prowling darkness. To lie flat was to mimic the dead, potentially inviting harm. Sitting sleep symbolized life and vigilance, a posture that protected the soul and kept it anchored within the body. Socially, the sitting sleep fostered communal bonds. Families and groups shared cramped quarters, and the upright position allowed many to rest in limited space. It also enabled quick response to emergencies like fire or attack. The segmented sleep pattern, with its waking period between first and second sleep, was naturally supported by this posture, facilitating prayer, conversation, or quiet tasks. The sitting sleep was deeply ingrained in culture and tradition. Even as technological advances slowly changed housing and heating, the habit persisted, sustained by centuries of experience and belief. It was not simply a way to sleep, but a way to live through the night, aware, connected, and ready. As you reflect on this, consider how the posture of sleep reveals the intimate relationship between humans and their environment, beliefs, and bodies. The sitting sleep of the 14th century is a window into a world where rest was negotiated with danger, faith, and practicality, revealing the enduring adaptability of human life. By the mid-14th century, the sitting sleep tradition had become so deeply rooted that it was woven into the very fabric of medieval existence. It was not just about comfort or habit. It was a vital adaptation to a complex web of environmental, social, medical, and spiritual factors. Homes were simple yet fraught with challenges. Thick stone walls or timber frames provided shelter but little insulation. Windows were small or non-existent, letting in cold drafts. The hearth was the home's center, providing warmth and light, but its smoke filled rooms without chimneys, creating a smoky, hazy atmosphere. In such conditions, sleeping flat was dangerous. Smoke could choke sleepers and cold floors were unforgiving. The sitting posture allowed people to rest while mitigating these risks. By propping themselves upright with pillows, bolsters, or benches, they kept airways clearer and lungs freer. This was especially important for those suffering from respiratory ailments, which were common and deadly. The humoral medical theories of the time supported this practice, associating reclining with the stagnation of bodily fluids and recommending elevated rest to maintain health. Culturally, the sitting sleep had symbolic importance. The dead lay flat, so to lie down fully was to mimic death's posture. Sleeping upright was a declaration of life and vigilance. It was a way to guard the soul against evil spirits believed to roam the night. Families slept clustered in close quarters, sharing warmth and watchfulness, their upright posture allowing them to react quickly to any threat, be it fire, theft, or illness. This practice also aligned naturally with the segmented sleep cycle prevalent at the time. People experienced a first sleep, followed by a period of wakefulness during which they might pray, talk quietly, or tend chores before returning to a second sleep. Sitting up made waking and moving easier during these intervals. The habit crossed social boundaries, from peasants in cramped cottages to nobles in drafty castles and monks in austere cells. Despite varying wealth and comfort, the upright sleeping posture was common, reflecting shared environmental and cultural realities. As the centuries passed and technologies improved, chimneys were introduced, better insulation developed, and medical understanding evolved, the need for sitting sleep diminished. Beds grew larger and softer, rooms warmer and less smoky. The modern concept of a single, uninterrupted sleep in a horizontal bed took hold. Yet, the sitting sleep of the 14th century remains a fascinating window into a time when survival, belief, and daily life intertwined so closely that even the way people rested was shaped by the world around them.